Welcome back to the second episode of our Maersk in Containerisation series. My name is Charlotte and I'm a historian here at Maersk, and I'm joined again by my colleague Henning.
This is Henning Morgen, and I'm really looking forward to focusing on the milestones of the Maersk Line history in containerization.
Yes, and last time we covered our company's initial steps into containerization, and we talked about the time leading up to we containerized our first service in 1975. In case you missed that first episode, I recommend that you check that one out first, as we will dive right into where we left off, and that was in 1986. And the reason for that being that we launched a new strategy in 1986. And Henning, could you elaborate a little bit about what that strategy was?
The management thought that we were now in a place where we were in a good place for growth. The situation was that we had containerized our route network, which was very much east-west around the globe at the time, not as global as it is today, of course. But we had containerized the network, and the questions that the management asked at the time in 1986 was really, do we want to grow organically by ourselves, or do we want to grow by acquisition? The decision was to go for growth by ourselves, and a very important means in that was the acquisition, the ordering of 14 large Panamax container vessels at our own shipyard, the Odense Steel Shipyard. A Panamax container vessel is one that is designed specifically to fit into the locks of the Panama Canal. So these 14 vessels were ordered, and they started coming into the route network in 1988, and then lockstroke. A year later, the Berlin Wall fell, and the geopolitical changes that happened after that meant that new markets opened up, and this happened in the middle of a period where Maersk Line was just geared for growth. We were so ready to move out into to the world. And that process very much got accelerated by the changes in the political situation in the world. It was on the doorstep of the 1990s. It's illustrated by the fact that in 1990 we were in 40 countries. 10 years later, Maersk Line was represented in more than 100 countries. So we basically became global, a global provider of containerized ocean services during the 1990s. We sent out a lot of young people graduating from our own internal training programs into the new markets in Argentina, Tunisia, Bulgaria, wherever, to start up businesses within shipping, within logistics, warehousing, terminal services, anything that was needed for our customers in those markets at the time.
But in the 90s, you mentioned that we focused on organic growth, but we also did our first acquisition in 1993.
Yes, that was a little bit by coincidence. Discussions had actually been going on with the Danish-British competitor called EAC Ben, but the negotiations really never led to anywhere in 1992. But then in 1993, that company realized that they were actually in trouble. And the result was that we acquired their liner services. When we did that, we became global because we did not have representation in Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Cambodia, but they did. So we took over those offices and established the Maersk brand, the Maersk Line brand actually, in those countries.
And 1993, that's also a very significant year because that was the year that Maersk Møller stepped down as daily CEO of Maersk.
Yes, this was the first time in our history that either AP Møller or Maersk Møller was not at the helm of the company as such, of the daily operations. The first time that a non-family CEO took over. That meant that Maersk Møller could focus on the group perspective rather on the daily operations. And one result of that was a letter that he started writing to all of these young people that were sent out to open up new offices. Many of them were relatively inexperienced. they were given a great task to go out and basically represent the Maersk name, represent the Maersk star in new markets where we had not been before. So it was very much that letter that Maersk Mc-Kinney started writing was very much about how do we want to be perceived, both as a company but also as persons. And should we reflect more on that when we speak of our core values? That is really the forerunner, so to speak, of today's 5 Maersk core values.
So that was when he really started to spread the word and try to...
That was the first time that they really got formalized, because, of course, the values have always been with us since the very beginning.
Yeah, exactly, but always represented by his leadership, right? So now he passed that on through that letter, Maybe we could also dive into, because a little later in the 90s, in 1999, we did some major acquisitions that had a significant impact.
Yes, because of the rise in world trade already in the early 1990s, we had to work to retain our market shares, and one way of doing that was cooperating with some competitors. The first major one was a cooperation with P&O, starting in 1990 on certain routes. But that cooperation was immediately replaced by a cooperation with Sealand. And during the cooperation with Sealand, we discovered that the peoples of the two organizations really worked well together. The two organizations' values, culture, style of working, the way that we treated our customers. So we could learn something from Sealand. Sealand learned something from us. And that basically led to the discussions when the owner of Sealand wanted to sell off the liner services. We were allowed to give an offer on that, and in 1999 we acquired the liner services of Sealand. That year also saw the acquisition of SAF Marine, which was also a really important acquisition, establishing us firmly in the African countries by a very solid brand. But the Sealand acquisition was special in many ways. We did acquire a lot of people, officers, container vessels, containers, but more importantly, also a portfolio of container terminals, which suddenly made the container terminal department within Maersk Line the third largest container terminal operator in the world. So very soon, the head of the department suggested, why don't we look at this as a standalone business? And in 2001, that department was more or less lifted out of Maersk Line, and APM Terminals was established as a standalone company.
Yes, and able to service third-party...
more than happy to service third-party customers.
Yeah, no, but I mean, because that was, of course, previously within Maersk Line, so very focused on Maersk Line, so now that was lifted out of...
Maersk Line, of course, did have a history in terminal operations.
Yeah.
We actually started already in 1958 in the New York area, in Brooklyn. And when we started container services in 1975, we took over our first
container terminal in Newark, New Jersey. Yeah.
And that was followed up with investments in Hong Kong. We set up our first hub in
Algeciras in Spain in 1986. Yeah.
So the establishment of APM Terminals was a formalization of an engagement that we had for some years already.
Yes, and maybe I can add to that when Maersk and Sealand combined, we operated 25 terminals. When it was lifted out as a separate business unit, within the first year, we operated more than 30 ports terminals, or had interest in more than 30 ports worldwide, and we had 7,000 people employed in APMT. And if we look at APM Terminals today, they employ around 22,000 people and have interest or operate around 75 terminals worldwide, spanning more than 40 countries. So,
looking back at the 1990s, it's also a decade of really significant developments on all parameters basically for a container shipping company. We introduced the largest container vessels in the world, basically already in 1988, but the really big ones came in the mid-1990s, starting out with a capacity around 11,000 TEU, which of course have more than doubled since. The internet came into existence in the mid-1990s and started slowly being utilized by shipping as well. We saw the rise of the freight forwarder, so an intermediate between us and our normal customer suddenly stepped in and became a factor. The supply chain management phrase was first coined in 1982, but supply chain management really came into play when IT became practical, when we started being able to record data, but also move that data to show the status of basically any stock keeping unit. So a lot of things that we talk about as normal things today were invented or adapted to shipping during the 1990s, at a time when the worldwide macroeconomic conditions also were very favorable for us.
Yes, but also it's not just a story about growth, and now I'm fishing because I want to talk about 2005 and the acquisition that we did, P&O Nedlloyd. Could you talk a bit into that as well?
I think it's fair to start with 1999 and say Sealand, that was a really well executed acquisition between two companies where, as I mentioned, the culture were very similar. It was not easy, but it was easier because people understood each other. We were interested in coming together. Everybody could see that there was a plus on this. Whereas the P&O Nedlloyd acquisition in 2005 basically was a hostile takeover. P&O Nedlloyd was on the stock exchange, and we made a bid, and it came as a surprise for P&O Nedlloyd. Not all employees in P&O Nedlloyd were interested, both at the management level, but also in the operational levels, and it became a problematic acquisition for many reasons. One of them certainly was IT, where, as it turned out, P&O Nedlloyd, without going into detail, P&O Nedlloyd had some well-functioning customer-faced systems. We were developing similar systems, but they were not ready for scale at the time of the acquisition. So with the expectation, and this is very generally speaking, with the expectation of Maersk that now we are doing another acquisition, we will basically try to execute it as well as we did with Sealand. It turned out that there were some obstacles on the way that made the whole process very problematic, both seen from the P&O Nedlloyd side, but certainly also from the Maersk Line side. Mm.
Yes, and that acquisition has certainly haunted us for a long time since, right?
And it happened, and of course nobody could know that at the time, but it happened and was not finalized when the finance crisis of 2007-2008 hit the world.
Maybe this is a good place to end this episode before we move on to our final episode in our Maersk in Containerisation series, which is going to cover the period from the financial crisis up until today. Thank you for joining me, Henning.
Thank you, Charlotte. Looking forward to the next time.
We'll see you next time.